Iron Man 3. The odd man out of the MCU, largely in part because even Marvel realized that the fake Mandarin was a bad move, and now are quickly backtracking on that with the upcoming Shang-Chi. On top of that, Tony pulled out the shrapnel from his arc reactor and essentially retired at the end of the movie, blowing up his suits, only to come right back in Age of Ultron with new suits. And no explanation as to why. Ultimately, Iron Man 3 isn't very consequential to the MCU because nothing that happens in this film really stays permanent and really affects the MCU going forward, which is why a lot of MCU fans are quick to dismiss it. But what if we were to look at this as a movie? What happens then? Well, you might just be surprised. Spoilers ahead for Iron Man 3 and the rest of the MCU. So, maybe you won't be surprised when you rewatch this movie, but I'll tell you right now that I was shocked after I saw this movie again. Let me give you some context before I begin the review. Iron Man 3 was one of the first MCU films that I watched in theaters since becoming a fan of the Marvel films. It was the first film that I was excited for, and I remember watching the trailers thinking that this movie is going to be awesome. We saw Tony Stark who was dealing with the repercussions of the Battle of New York, and I thought that that was such a good angle to take the next Iron Man film in. And on top of that, you saw the intimidating, frightening, dark villain in Ben Kingsley's The Mandarin. In short, I was so prepared for a dark, thoughtful character piece as Tony fights his inner demons as well as this terrorist. And instead, as we all know too well by now, we got this. Suffice it to say that we were not really ready for this kind of movie that Shane Black delivered. And every subsequent rewatch after the initial 2013 release, I just couldn't separate my distaste for the direction that they took Iron Man 3 in. Let me be clear, it's not that I hated the Trevor Slattery twist as much as a lot of other people did. What I hated was what they left behind. The filmmaker spent the first 2/3 of the movie setting up this really exciting thriller involving this terrorist who seems to have AIM, led by Aldrich Killian, at his fingertips as he plans to exploit the world and the United States. And instead we got, again, this. So again, my disappointment does not come from what we did get, but rather what we could have gotten. It's important that I make this distinction. At the same time, with the MCU Rewatch series, I really am striving to go into each film fresh. I have my old MCU rankings stored on a note somewhere, but I'm not referring to that at all, and instead I'm just completely re-ranking the films based on how I feel about them right now. And already, comparing the two with the 7 films that I've seen, it looks like they're going to turn out pretty differently. And for the most part, I think that's a great thing. Because in this go-around, I've really tried to purposely find things that I like about each film. Yes, as a person who analyzes film, it's important to be critical and analytical, absolutely, but it's also equally as important in my eyes to not let that overshadow any enjoyment that you might oversee. What's the point of intentionally trying to hate something? You're just missing out. All that to say that I had an absolute blast with Iron Man 3. I was so surprised because I kept waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for that moment that I would go, right there. Right there is where I start hating this movie. And I have to tell you, it just never came. First of all, to reiterate, I loved a solid chunk of Iron Man 3 even in previous viewings, and I think the first maybe 1/3 was brilliant. It felt less Jon Favreau, but not in a bad way. Shane Black has an equally unique voice, and it was a great direction for Tony. I also just love the callback to Yinsen in the 1999 Switzerland conference. Hats off to Kevin Feige for that attention to detail. We move to present day where Tony is dealing with his PTSD and coping in the way that only he knows how, which is tinkering. Again, I legitimately think that this is a brilliant direction to take this character. I mean, if you experience the things that he did in the Avengers, I think we all would be losing it a little bit. Rewatching this again, I even love the little line where Tony tells Pepper that there's a threat coming, alluding to the fact that he has been thinking about Thanos subconsciously all the way back in Iron Man 3. That's good storytelling. And then we're introduced to the Mandarin, who again, the televised version at least, I think is terrifying in the best kind of way. Unlike, I don't know, say Malekith or Ronan, even though they're supposed to be way more intimidating. When I was watching these scenes again, I was just trying my absolute best to ignore what I knew was going to come later on in the movie with Trevor, and I found myself gripped with the portrayal of this villain. What makes Iron Man 3 so good to me is just how well thought out most of it is. If you look at Aldrich Killian, and we'll get to him a little more later, I think that his motivations are actually some of the best in the MCU. Again, this doesn't have anything to do with the execution or the performance, this is just the villain's motivation that was written in the script. I mean, think about it. You have this guy who's physically crippled, but he's brilliant, and he comes to Tony for help, but he's spurned, and so he develops extremists to help others who have similar physical needs. And then he realizes that he can leverage this. His line later where he says that if you give evil a face, they'll go after that, that's so clever because, as he says, being anonymous was the most important thing to him. These are just little subtle lines that allude to his motivations that I just didn't pick up in previous rewatches. And then in his mind, when he kidnaps the president and kills him, I realized for the first time that he had the vice president ready. So once the president was out of the picture, the vice president could just take his place and Killian would have control of the United States, and the world even, without anyone ever knowing. And that's actually really brilliant. And then he yells that he's the Mandarin, and that's still incredibly stupid, but we'll get there. There are just little details that line up so well and cohesively, like after Tony escapes the mansion attack, he flies away in the Iron Man suit. And while, yes, Jarvis, read the room, that probably wasn't the best idea, it makes sense why he would end up in Tennessee, because you see earlier that he told Jarvis to create a flight plan for Rose Hill. There are just little story elements that I picked up this time around that made me appreciate this film even more. And the action. First of all, I have to give massive props to Brian Tyler, the composer of this film. He's done a couple Marvel films, I believe, and while a lot of his music isn't that memorable, he did give us the Iron Man 3 theme. And the Iron Man 3 theme is one of the best superhero themes that I've ever heard. It's my second favorite in the MCU next to the Avengers, of course, and it's just so good. It builds to this kind of euphoric apex, and pair that with the action, and you have something really special. The action itself is some of the best in the MCU, and I will stand by that. Maybe not the ending fight with the 42 Iron Man suits though, that did feel a little generic and kind of superhero-y, but it was still enjoyable and fun nevertheless. But for example, the scene where the mansion's exploding, I maintain that that's one of the best Iron Man scenes ever, period. I feel like the Malibu mansion attack scene doesn't get enough credit. However, let's talk about how we get there, because I do have some pretty big criticisms about the film that prevent it from being top tier for me. The first of which is Tony's character. Now, 80% of the time in this movie, Tony's great. It's the Tony Stark that we remember and love from the previous 3 films that he was in. But the other 20% was a little strange. I don't know what Shane Black wanted to do, but there are just a few points where Tony is either extremely stupid or unnecessarily mean. It's jarring, and I really don't know why they decided to go that route. First of all, the scene where he gives the Mandarin and the entire press his home address, I mean, that scene makes me want to scream every time I see it. This is an example of the writers not knowing how to get the Mandarin to attack Tony's house, so they make him do something so incredibly dumb by announcing his address to everyone on television. And then when he meets Harley, he treats him so rudely sometimes that it makes me almost dislike Tony as a character. Now, I get it. He's sarcastic, he's witty, and Harley can be intentionally a little annoying to Tony because he's a kid. But the things that Tony says to him and the way that he treats him sometimes, it just doesn't feel good, and it's not a good look to me. Speaking of Harley though, a lot of people have mixed reactions and opinions on his character and inclusion in the film, and to be honest, although that this is a rather boring answer, I fall somewhere right down the middle. I think Shane Black writes dialogue about as good as it gets for a kid to deliver, so that he doesn't feel too kiddie and immature like a lot of other movies, but he just kind of feels a little random, especially with the way that Tony treats him. If there was a little thing at the end where Tony realized the value of his father in his life or something like that, and then, applied that to Harley, I think I would be on board. Kind of like how he treats Peter Parker later on. But as it stands, when I saw Harley appear at the Endgame funeral, I was like, yeah, Tony kind of liked you, but I don't think that much, from what I gathered anyways. Let's talk about the dialogue though. As I mentioned in my review for the Avengers, I think the dialogue in that film was just a little bit much in that movie. It was a little over the top and tried to be a little too clever in certain scenarios. However, I think Shane Black shows in this movie that he's just a brilliant writer. His dialogue is fast and quippy and sharp, but it never beats you over the head with it. Pair that with Robert Downey Jr. delivering the lines, and it's just a match made in heaven. There are even just little subtle lines like Rhodey saying, you breathe fire. That just seems so natural and not artificially comedic, which I really enjoyed. But let's be honest, you're probably not here to an Iron Man 3 review to hear me wax poetic about dialogue. You probably want me to talk about the Mandarin twist, and you probably want to know my thoughts on it. So here they are. I like it. Now, before anyone goes into the comments and starts yelling at me, please hear me out and let me explain, because as with most things, it's not that simple. Like I mentioned before, when I finished this movie, I just wish that they had gone for it with the real Mandarin arc, because again, the real Mandarin, in the television at least, was terrifying, and it would have just been so much better in my opinion if they had stuck with the real Mandarin and had him be the real boss and he was using Killian for extremis rather than the other way around. That being said, if they were going to do the twist, then I think they did it about as well as they could have. Was it a little irreverent? Maybe. It almost felt like they were laughing in the faces of the fans for a little bit there. But I have to tell you that the reveal is legitimately funny and shocking. I laughed out loud having not seen the film in a while when Tony's interrogating Trevor for the first time, because you're able to see the frustration in Tony that you feel as an audience member. A word on expectations though before I go on. If you're going to subvert expectations, you need to deliver something that is better than what we would have gotten otherwise. The prime example is, of course, the "No, I am your father" line from The Empire Strikes Back. Obviously, the new direction for the story was so much better than just a general good guy versus bad guy plot, and that's why we all adore it. So is the fake Mandarin plot better than what we could have gotten? Absolutely not. But like I said before, if they were going to do it, they did it the best that they could have, and I'll respect them for that at least. Before I conclude this review, I do want to briefly touch on Aldrich Killian. Like I mentioned before, his motivations were clearly set up, but how was the execution? Well, thinking back to previous rewatches, I always remembered him going absolutely crazy in the third act. But Actually, I was quite surprised to see how subtle and calm he was for most of the final fight. He never went Jeff Bridges crazy until the final scene where he says, "I am the Mandarin." If they had cut that one line out of the film, then I think this movie would have made a whole lot more sense. Because now we have to deal with the fact that Trevor Slattery is impersonating the Mandarin, but Killian is the Mandarin, except he's not because the real Mandarin is coming in Shang-Chi. So who even knows what's happening with that character anymore? In the end, as the film wrapped up, I could totally see what they were going for. For those of you who don't know, Robert Downey Jr.'s contract was expiring after this movie, and they actually didn't know until shortly before Ultron started whether or not he would be coming back. This could have been it for Tony, and if you view the ending of the film like that, especially with the last line of "I am Iron Man," then yeah, it makes perfect sense. Maybe the reason that fans felt a little bothered about this movie is that it just feels like it doesn't matter in the MCU, kinda like Hulk. Nothing in the movie really affects anything going forward, but again, given the context of the film's release, as well as just looking at the movie on its own, I really think that you'll find that there's a lot of enjoyment to be had. This is the biggest 180 I think I've ever done on any MCU movie, and I'm kind of doubtful that I'll do an even bigger turn on any other movie as we continue onwards. Who knows though, maybe I'll say Thor the Dark World's the best MCU movie, and maybe I'll hate Endgame. Probably not. But after being surprised this much by Iron Man 3, you never know. Well, this third installment in the trilogy has its problems, and yes, the third act is pretty generic when it comes down to it. The film has a lot more to offer than you might think. I would encourage you all to actually rewatch this film if you didn't like it the first time, and just keep an open mind and try to enjoy it. Because you might be surprised. I'm going to give Iron Man 3 a B and a 7.9 out of 10. And even if you don't like this movie, come on. The giant rabbit is iconic. Automatically makes it a great movie. What are your thoughts on Iron Man 3? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about the Mandarin twist. Again, these are just my thoughts, and I'm sure a lot of you guys will disagree, which is totally fine. Comment down below, and remember to subscribe and hit the like button. Also remember to hit the bell to get notifications for my next videos. I'm trying to post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, so stay tuned then. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.